Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 4 of The Lord of the Flies, where we last left off with our Chapter 3 reading. The main thing that happened in Chapter 3 was there was a conflict between Jack and Ralph. Jack was desperately trying to hunt, and he really wanted to catch a pig. But Ralph kept saying that the number one priority right now should be to build a shelter. Ralph also showed frustrations because while Jack was going off and trying to hunt a pig, he actually wasn't catching anything, so pretty much he was doing nothing. Meanwhile, Ralph was stuck at the beach, trying to do all the work by himself, and as he said, all the little ones and all the other ones, the people who were left at the beach, really did not help him. So this was the first time we really saw this conflict kind of brewing between the characters of Jack and Ralph. So we're going to see if that conflict sticks around as we get into Chapter 2, which we're going to begin right now. And by that, I meant Chapter 4. Chapter 4, Painted Faces and Long Hair. The first rhythm that they became used to was the slow swing from dawn to quick dusk. They accepted the pleasure of morning, the bright sun, the whelming sea and sweet air as time when play was good and life was so full that hope was not necessary and therefore forgotten. Towards noon, as the floods of light fell more nearly to the perpendicular, the stark colors of the morning were smoothed in pearl and opalescence, and in the heat, as though the impending sun height gave it momentum. It became a blow that they ducked, running to the shade and lying there, perhaps even sleeping. Strange things happened at midday. The glittering sea rose up, moved apart in plains of blatant impossibility. The coral reef and the few stunted palms that clung to the more elevated parts would float up into the sky, and they would quiver and be plucked apart and run like raindrops on a wire or be repeated as in an odd succession of mirrors. And sometimes land loomed where there was no land and flicked out like a bubble as the children watched. Piggy discounted all this learnedly as a mirage, and since no boy could reach even the reef over the stretch of water where the snapping sharks waited, they grew accustomed to these mysteries and they ignored them, just as they ignored the miraculous throbbing scars. And at midday, the illusions merged into the sky, and there the sun gazed down like an angry eye. And then at the end of the afternoon, the mirage subsided and the horizon became level and blue and clipped as the sun declined. And that was another time of comparative coolness, but it was menaced by the coming of the dark. And when the sun sank, darkness dropped on the island like an extinguisher. And soon the shelters were full of restlessness under the remote stars. And nevertheless, the northern European traditions of work, play, and food right through the day made it possible for them to adjust themselves wholly to this new rhythm. The Litland, Percival, had early crawled into shelter and stayed there for 2 days, talking, singing, and crying, till they thought him batty and were faintly amused. And ever since then he had been peaked, red-eyed, and miserable, a Litland who played little and who cried often. The smaller boys were known now by the generic title of Litlands. Their decrease in size from Ralph down was gradual, and though there was a dubious region inhabited by Simon and Robert and Maurice, nevertheless no one had any difficulty in recognizing big ones at the end and little ones as the other. The undoubted little ones, whose age ranged to be about 6, led a quite distinct and at the same time intense life of their own. They ate most of the day, picked fruit where they could reach it, and not particular about ripeness or quality. They were used now to stomach aches and a sort of chronic diarrhea. They suffered untold terrors in the dark and huddled together for comfort. And apart from food and sleep, they found time for play, aimless and trivial, and the white sand by the bright water. They cried for their mothers much less often than they might have been expected, and they were very brown and filthy dirty. They obeyed their summons of the conch, partly because Ralph blew it, and he was big enough to be a link with the adult world of authority, and partly because they enjoyed the entertainment of all the assemblies. But otherwise, they seldom bothered with the big ones, and they were passionately emotional, and corporate life was their own. They had built castles in the sand at the bar of the little river. These castles were 1 foot high and were decorated with shells, withered flowers, and interesting stones. Around the castles with a complex of marks, track walls, railroad lines, and they were significant only if inspected with the eye at beach level. The lit ones played here, if not happily, at least with absorbed intention, and often as many as 3 of them would play the same game together. 3 were playing here now, and Henry was the biggest one of them. He was also a distant relative of the other boy, whose mulberry-marked face had not been since the evening of the great fire. But he was not old enough to understand this, and if he had been told that the other boy had gone home in an aircraft, he would have accepted that statement without fuss or disbelief. Henry was a bit of a leader this afternoon, because the other 2 were Percival and Johnny, who were the smallest boys of the island. Percival was a mouse-colored and could not have been very attractive even to his own mother. Johnny, though, was well-built and had fair hair and natural belligerence. Just now he was being obedient because he was interested, and the 3 children, kneeling in the sand, were at peace. Roger and Maurice came out of the forest. They were relieved from the duty at the fire and had come down for a swim. Roger led the way straight through the castles, kicking them over, burying the flowers, scattering the chosen stones. And Maurice followed, laughing, and added to the destruction. The 3 little ones paused in the game and looked up. And as it happened, the particular marks in which they were interested had not been touched, so they made no protest. Only Percival began to whimper with an eyeful of sand, and Maurice hurried away. In his other life, Maurice had received chastisement for fouling a younger eye with the sand. Now, though, there were no parent to let fall a heavy hand, so Maurice still felt the unease of wrongdoing, and at the back of his mind formed the uncertain outlines of an excuse. He muttered something about a swim and broke into a trot. So then only Roger remained, watching the Litlunds. He was not noticeably darker than when he had dropped in, but the shock of black hair down his nape and low on his forehead seemed to suit his gloomy face and made what seemed at first to be an unsociable remoteness into something forbidding. Percival finished his whimper and went on playing, and for the tears had washed the sand away. Johnny watched with him as the china blue eyes then began to fling up sand in the shower, and presently Percival was crying again. When Henry was tired of his play and wandered off along the beach, Roger followed him, keeping beneath the palms and drifting casually in the same direction. Henry walked at a distance from the palms in the shade because he was too young to keep to himself out of the sun. He went down the beach and busied himself in the water's edge. The great Pacific tide was coming in, and every few seconds the relatively still water of the lagoon heaved forward an inch. There were creatures that lived in this last fling of the sea, tiny transparencies that came questing and with the water over the hot, dry sand. With impalpable organs of sense, they examined this new field. Perhaps food had appeared where the last incursion there had been none. There were bird droppings, insects perhaps, any of the drone detritus of the landward life. Like a myriad of tiny teeth in a saw, the transparencies came scavenging over the beach. This was fascinating to Henry. He poked about with a bit of stick, and itself was a wave-worn and whitened and vagrant, and tried to control the motions of the scavengers. He made little runnels that the tide filled and tried to crowd them with creatures. He became absorbed beyond mere happiness as he felt himself exercising control over all the living things. He talked to them, urging them, ordering them. Driven back by the tide, his footprints became bays in which they were trapped and gave him the illusion of mastery. He squatted on his hams of the water's edge, bowed with a shock of their falling over his forehead and past his eyes, and that afternoon's sun emptied down invisible arrows. Roger waited too. At first he had hidden behind a great palm, but Henry's absorption with the transparencies was so obvious, at last he stood out in full view. He looked along the beach, and Percival had gone off crying, and Johnny was left in a triumphant possession of the castles. He sat there crooning to himself and throwing sand at imaginary Percival. Beyond him, though, Roger could see the platform and glints of spray where Ralph and Simon and Piggy and Maurice were diving into the pool. He listened carefully, but he only could just hear them. There was a sudden breeze that shook the fringe of the palm trees so that the fronds tossed and fluttered. 60 feet above Roger, several nuts, fribious and lumps as big as rugby balls, were loose from their stems. They fell about him with a series of hard thumps, and he was not touched. Roger did not consider his escape, but looked from the nuts to Henry and back again. The subsoil beneath the palm trees was a raised beach, and generations of palms had worked loose in this, all the stones that had lain on the sands of another shore. Roger stooped, he picked up a stone, aimed, and threw it at Henry, but he threw to a miss. The stone that had tokened the preposterous time bounced 5 yards to Henry's right and fell in the water. Roger gadfled a handful of more stones and began to throw them. Yet there was a space around Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, and to which he dare not throw. Here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and school and policemen and the law. Roger's arm was conditioned by a civilization that knew nothing of him and was in ruins. Henry was surprised by the plopping sounds in the water. He abandoned the noiseless transparencies and pointed at the center of the spreading ring like a setter. This side and that stone fell, and Henry turned obediently, but always too late to see the stones in the air. At last he saw one and laughed, looking for the friend who was teasing him. But Roger had whipped behind the palm again and was leaning against it, breathing quickly, his eyelids fluttering, and then Henry lost interest in the stones and just wandered off. Roger! Jack was standing under a tree about 10 yards away when Roger opened his eyes and saw him. A darker shadow crept from the swarthiness of the skin, but Jack noticed nothing. He was eager, impatient, beckoning so that Roger went to him. There was a small pool at the end of the river, dammed back by sand and full of white water lilies and needle-like reeds. Here Sam and Eric were waiting, and Bill, Jack, concealed from the sun, knelt by the pool and opened the 2 large leaves that he carried. One of them contained white clay and the other one red. By them lay a stick of charcoal about down from the fire. Jack explained to Roger as he worked. They don't smell me, they see me. I think. Something pink under the trees. He smeared on the clay. If only I had some green. He turned a half-concealed face up at Roger and answered the incomprehension of his gaze. For hunting, like in the war, you know, dazzle paint. Like things that they look to, like makes you look like something else. He twisted in the urgency of telling. Like moss on a tree trunk. Roger understood, and he nodded gravely. The twins moved towards Jack and began to protest timidly about something, but Jack just waved them away. He rubbed the charcoal stick between the patches of red and white on his face. No, you two, you come with me. He peered at the reflection, and he disliked it. He bent down, took a double handful of lukewarm water, and rubbed the mess from his face. Freckles and sandy eyebrows appeared again, and Roger smiled unwillingly. You don't half look a mess. Jack planned his new face. He made one cheek and one eye socket white, and he rubbed red all over the other half of his face and slashed a black bar of charcoal across from right ear to the left jaw. He looked in the pool for his reflection, but his breathing troubled the mirror. Samir, give me a coconut, an empty one. He knelt, holding the shell of water. A round patch of sunlight fell off his face, and a brightness appeared in the depths of the water. He looked in the astonishment, no longer himself, but in an awesome stranger. He split the water, and he leaped to his feet, laughing excitedly. Ha ha ha! Besides the pool, his sinewy body held up a mask that drew their eyes and appalled them. He began to dance in his laughter and became a bloodthirsty snarling. He capered towards Bill, and the mask was a thing of its own, behind which Jack had hid, liberated from his shame and self-consciousness. The face of red and white and black swung from the air and jigged towards Bill. Bill started up again laughing, and then suddenly he fell silent and blundered away through the bushes. Jack rushed towards the twins. The rest are making a line. Come on. But we? Come on. I'll creep up and I'm going to stab that pig. The mask compelled them. They had no choice but to follow Jack. Meanwhile, Ralph climbed out of the bathing pool and trotted up the beach and sat in the shade beneath the palms. His fair hair was plastered over his eyebrows, and he blushed it back. Simon was floating in the water and kicking with his feet, and Maurice was practicing diving. Piggy was mooning about, aimlessly picking up things and discarding them. The rock pools which so fascinated him were covered by the tide, so he was without an interest until the tide went back. Presently, seeing Ralph under the palms, he came up and he sat by him. Piggy wore the remainders of the pairs of shorts. His fat body was golden brown, and the glasses still flashed when he looked at anything. He was the only boy on the island whose hair never seemed to grow. The rest were shock-headed, but Piggy's hair still lay in wisps over his eyes, as though baldness were his natural state, and his imperfect covering would soon go, like the velvet of a young stag's antlers. "I've been thinking," he said, "about a clock. We could make a sundial. We could put a stick in the sand and then—" The effort to express the mathematical process involved was too great. He made a few passes instead. "Yeah, and then we'll make an airplane and a TV set," Ralph said sorely. "And after that, we'll make a steam engine, too. Good thinking, Piggy." Piggy shook his head. "You have to have a lot of metal for things like that, and we haven't got metal, but we do have a stick." Ralph turned and smiled involuntarily. Piggy was a bore. His fat, his asthma, his matter-of-fact ideas were dull, but there was always a little pleasure to be gotten out of pulling his leg, even if it did only happen by accident. Piggy saw the smile and misinterpreted it as friendliness. There had been a grown-up tacitly among the big ones the opinion that Piggy was an outsider, not only by his accent, which did not matter, but by, the fact that he was fat, that he had asthma, that he had specs, that he had certain disinclination for manual labor. Now finding that something he had said made Ralph smile, he rejoiced and pressed his advantage. "We got lots of sticks. We could have a sundial each, and then we could know what time it was." "A fat lot of good that would be." "You said you wanted things done, so we could be rescued." "Oh, shut up." He leaped to his feet and trotted back to the pool, just as Maurice did, a rather poor dive. Ralph was glad for a chance to change the subject. He shouted as Maurice came to the surface, "Belly flop! Belly flop!" Maurice flashed a smile at Ralph, who slid easily into the water. Of all the boys, he was the most at home there, but today, irked by the mention of rescue, the useless footing mention of rescue, even the green depths of water and the shattered golden sun held no balm. Instead of remaining and playing, he swam with steady strokes towards Simon and crawled out of the other side of the pool to lie there, sleeking and streaming like a seal. Piggy, who was, always clumsy, stood up and came to stand by him, so that Ralph rolled up his stomach and pretended not to see him. The mirages had died away, and gloomily he ran his eye along the taut blue line of the horizon. The next moment he was on his feet again and shouting, "Smoke! Smoke!" Simon tried to sit up in the water and got a mouthful of Maurice, who had been standing ready to dive. Swayed back to the heels, made a bolt for the platform, and then they swerved back to the grass under the palms. There he started to pull on his tattered shorts or be ready for anything. Ralph stood, one hand holding back his hair, the other clenched. Simon was climbing out of the water too, and Piggy was rubbing his glasses on his shorts and squinting at the sea. Maurice had got both legs through one leg of the shorts, and out of all the boys at this moment, Ralph was the only one who was still. "I can see no smoke. I can't see no smoke, Ralph. Where is it?" Piggy said incredulously. Ralph said nothing. Now both his hands were clenched over his forehead so that the fair hair was kept out of his eyes. He was leaning forward, and already the salt was whitening his body. "Ralph, where's the ship?" At this moment, Simon stood by, looking from Ralph to the horizon. Maurice's trousers gave way in a sigh, and he abandoned them as a wreck, rushed towards the forest, and then came back again. The smoke was a little knot of horizon and uncoiled slowly. Beneath the smoke was a dot that had been made into a funnel. Ralph's face was pale as he spoke to himself. "They'll see our smoke!" Piggy was looking at the right direction now. "It don't look much!" He turned around and peered up the mountain, and Ralph continued to watch the ship ravenously. Color was coming back into his face, and Simon stood by him silent. "I know I can't see very much, but have we even got any smoke?" Ralph moved impatiently, still watching the ship. "The smoke on the mountain! Duh!" Maurice came running and stared at the sea. Both Simon and Piggy were looking up at the mountain, and Piggy screwed up his face, but Simon cried as though he had hurt himself. "Ralph! Ralph!" The quality of his speech twisted Ralph on the sand. "You tell me, is there a signal?" Ralph looked back at dispersing smoke in the horizon, then up the mountain. "Ralph, please! Is there a signal or isn't there?" Simon put out his hand timidly to touch Ralph, but Ralph turned to run, splashing through the shallow end of this bathing pool, across the hot, white sand and under the palms. A moment later, he was battling with the complex undergrowth that was already engulfing the scar, and Simon ran after him, and then Maurice, and Piggy shouted, "Ralph, please, Ralph!" Then he, too, started to run, stumbling over Maurice's discarded shorts before he was across the terrace. Behind the four boys, the smoke moved gently across the horizon and onto the beach. Henry and Johnny were throwing sand at Percival, who was crying quietly again, and all three were in complete ignorance of the excitement. By the time Ralph had reached the landward end of the scar, he was using precious breath just to swear. He did desperate violence to his naked body among the rasping creepers so that the blood was sliding over him. Just where the steep ascent of the mountain began, he stopped. Maurice was only a few yards away behind him at this point. "Piggy Specs! If the fire's all out, we're going to need him!" He stopped shouting and swayed on his feet, and Piggy was just only then visible, bumbling up from the beach. Ralph looked at the horizon, then up at the mountain. Was it better to fetch Piggy's glasses, or would the ship have gone by then? Or if they climbed on, supposing the fire was all out, and they had to watch Piggy crawling nearer to the ship sinking under the horizon? What to do? Balanced on a high peak of need, agonized by indecision, Ralph cried out, "Oh God! Oh God!" Simon struggled with the bushes, caught his breath. His face was twisted. Ralph blundered on, savaging himself as the wisp of smoke moved on. When they got up there, they noticed the fire was dead. They saw that straight away. They saw what they had already known down on the beach when the smoke had first been beckoned. The fire was out, smokeless and dead, and all the watchers were gone. A pile of unused fuel lay steady. Ralph turned to the sea. The horizon stretched impersonal once more, barren at all but the faintest trace of smoke. Ralph ran, stumbling along the rocks, saved himself on the edge of the pink cliff, and screamed at the ship, "Come back! Come back!" Simon and Maurice arrived. Ralph looked at them with unwinking eyes. Simon turned away, smearing the water from his cheeks, and Ralph reached inside himself for the worst word he knew. "They let the bloody fire go out!" He looked down at the unfriendly side of the mountain. Piggy arrived, out of breath, of course, and whimpering like a little one. Ralph clenched his fist and went very red. The intentness of his gaze, the bitterness of his voice pointed for him. "There they are!" A procession had appeared, far down among the pink stones that lay near the water's edge. Some of the boys wore black hats, but otherwise they were pretty much naked. They lifted sticks in the air together whenever they came in an easy patch. They were chanting something to and fro with a bundle that the errant twins carried so carefully. Ralph picked out Jack easily, even at a distance, tall, red-haired, and inevitably leading the procession. Simon looked down now, from Ralph to Jack, as he had looked from Ralph to the horizon, and what he saw seemed to make him afraid. Ralph said nothing more, but waited while the procession came nearer. The chant was audible, but at the distance still wordless, and behind Jack walked the twins, carrying a great stake on their shoulders. The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily, as the twins toiled over the uneven ground. The pig's head hung down from a gaping neck and seemed to search for something on the ground. At last, the words of the chant floated up to them across the bow of the blackened woods and ashes. "Kill the pig! Cut her throat! Spill her blood! Kill the pig! Cut her throat! Spill her blood!" Yet as the words became audible, the procession reached the steepest part of the mountain, and in a minute or two the chant had died away. Piggy sniveled, and Simon shushed himself as quickly as though he had often been too loudly at church. Jack, his face smeared with the clays, reached the top first and hailed Ralph excitedly with a lifted spear. "Look, we killed a pig! We stole him up and we got in a circle!" Voices broke in from the hunters. "We got in a circle! We crept up! The pig squealed!" The twins stood with the pig swinging behind them. dropping black gouts on the rock. They seemed to share a one-eyed, ecstatic grin, and Jack had too many things to tell Ralph at once. Instead, he danced a step or two, and then he remembered his dignity, and he stood still, grinning. He noticed blood on his hands and grimaced distastefully, looked out for something in which to clean them, and then wiped them on his shorts and laughed. Ralph spoke first. "You let the fire go out!" Jack checked, vaguely irritated by the irrelevance, but too happy to let it worry him. "Oh, we can light that fire again. You should have been with us, Ralph. We had a smashing time. The twins got knocked over by that pig." "Yeah, we hit the pig. I fell on top. I even cut the pig's throat," Jack said, proudly and yet twitching as he said it. "Can I borrow yours, Ralph, to make a nick of the hilt?" The boys chattered and danced. The twins continued to grin. "There was a lashing of blood," said Jack, laughing and shouting. "You should have seen it. There was so much blood, Ralph." I think at this point we're going to go hunting every day." Ralph spoke again, hoarsely. He had not moved. "You let the fire go out!" The repetition made Jack uneasy. He looked at the twins and then back at Ralph. "Yeah, we had to go on the hunt. Or that wouldn't have been enough for a ring. We wouldn't have had any food." He fluxed, conscious of a fault. "The fire's been out for an hour or two. We can light it up again. No worries, man. Don't worry, Ralph." He noticed Ralph's scared nakedness and the somber silence of all the four of them. He sought, charitable in his happiness, to include them in the thing that had happened. His mind was crowded with memories of the knowledge that had come to them when they had closed in on that struggling pig. Knowledge that they had outwitted a living thing. They had opposed their will upon that pig, and they had taken away the life of that pig. Like a long, satisfying drink. Ah! He spread his arms wide. "Ah, you should have seen all the blood there, Ralph!" The hunters were more silent now, but at this they buzzed again, and Ralph flung back his hair. One arm pointed at the empty horizon. His voice was loud and savage and struck them into silence. "There was a ship!" Jack, faced at once with too many awful implications, ducked away from them. He laid a hand on the pig and drew his knife, and Ralph brought his arm down, fist clenched, and his voice shook. "There was a ship out there! You said you'd keep the fire going, and you let it out!" He took a step towards Jack, who turned and faced him. "They might have seen us! We might have gone home!" This was too bitter for Piggy, who forgot his timidity and the agony of loss. He began to cry out shrilly, "You and your bloodlust, Jack Merridew! You and your hunting! We might have gone home!" Ralph pushed Piggy to one side. "I was chief, and you were going to do what I said. You talk, but you can't even build huts, and then you go off hunting and let the fire go out." He turned away, silent for a moment. Then his voice came back again on a peak of feeling. "There was a ship!" One of the smaller hunters began to wail. The dismal truth was flittering through to everybody. Jack went very red as he hacked and pulled at the pig. "The job was too much. We needed everyone." Ralph turned. "You could have had everyone if the shelters were finished, but no, you had to hunt. We needed meat." Jack stood up, in his face, the bloodiest knife in his hand, and the two boys faced each other. There was this brilliant world of hunting, tactics, fierce exhilaration, skill, and there was the world of longing and baffled common sense. Jack transferred the knife to his left hand and smudged blood over his forehead as he pushed down the plastered hair. And Piggy began again. "You didn't ought to have let that fire out. You said that you'd keep the smoke going." This from Piggy and the wails of agreement from some of the hunters drove Jack to violence. The boiling look came into his blue eyes, and he took a step, able to at last hit someone, and at this moment he struck his fist into Piggy's stomach. Boom! Piggy sat down with a grunt, and Jack stood over him. His voice was vicious with humiliation. "You would ya, fatty?" Ralph made a step forward, and Jack smacked Piggy's head. Piggy's glasses flew off and tinkled on the rocks, and Piggy cried out in terror, "My smacks!" He went crouching and feeling over the rocks, but Simon, who got there first, found them for him. Passions beat about Simon on the mountain top with awful wings. One side's broken. Piggy grabbed them and put on the glasses. He looked malevolently at Jack. I've got to have them specs. Now I got only one eye. Just you wait. Jack made a move towards Piggy, who scrambled away till a rock lay between them. He thrust his head over the top and glared at Jack through his one flashing glass. Now I've got only one eye. You just wait. Jack mimicked the whine and scramble. Just you wait. Oh! Piggy and the parody were so funny that the hunters began to laugh. Jack felt encouraged. He was on scrambling with laughter rose from the gale of hysteria. Unwillingly, Ralph felt his lips twitch. He was angry with himself for giving way. He muttered, "That was a dirty trick." Jack brought out his gyration and stood facing Ralph. His words came out in a shout. All right, all right. He looked at Piggy, at the hunters, and at Ralph. I'm sorry about the fire, He drew himself up. I apologize, all right? The buzz came from the hunters and one of the admiration of the handsome behaviors. Clearly, they were all of the opinion that Jack had done the decent thing and had put himself in the right by generous apology, and Ralph obscurely in the wrong. They waited for an appropriately decent answer, yet Ralph's throat refused to pass one. He resented, as an addition to Jack's misbehavior, this verbal trick. The fire was dead and the ship was gone. Could they not see? Anger instead of decency passed his throat. That was a dirty trick. They were silent at the mountaintop, while the opaque look appeared in Jack's eyes had passed away. Ralph's final word was an ingracious mutter. All right, light the fire again. And with some positive action before them, a little of the tension died. Ralph said no more, he did nothing, and he stood looking down at the ashes around his feet. Jack was loud, and Jack was active. He gave orders, he sang, he whistled, he threw remarks at the silent Ralph, remarks that did not need an answer, and therefore could not invite a snub. And still Ralph was silent. No one, not even Jack, would ask him to move the end that they had to build a fire 3 yards away from, and place not really as convenient. And so Ralph asserted his chiefmanship, and could not have chosen a better way if he had done so for days. Against his weapons, so undefinable and so effective, Jack was powerless and raged without knowing why. By the time the pile was built, they were on different sides of a high barrier. And when they had dealt with the fire, another crisis arose. Jack had no means of lighting it. Then, to his surprise, Ralph went to Piggy and took his glasses from him. Not even Ralph knew how the link between him and Jack had been snapped and fastened elsewhere. I'll bring him back. I'll come too. Piggy stood beside him, island in a sea of meaningless color, while Ralph knelt and focused the glassy spots on the wood. Instantly, a fire began to light. Piggy held out his hands and grabbed his glasses back. Before these fantastically attractive flowers of violet and red and yellow, unkindness melted away. They became a circle of boys around a campfire, and even Piggy and Ralph were half drawn in. Soon some of the boys were rushing down the slope for more wood while Jack hacked the pig. They tried holding the whole carcass at a stake over the fire, but the stake burnt more quickly than the pig roasted. And in the end, they skewered bits of meat on branches and held them in the flames, and even then, almost as much boy was roasted as meat. Ralph's mouth watered. He meant to refuse meat, but his diet of fruit and nuts with an occasional crab or fish gave him too little resistance. He accepted a piece of the half-raw meat and gnawed it like a wolf. Piggy spoke, also dribbling. Aren't I having none? Jack meant to leave him in doubt, as an assertion of power, but Piggy, by advertising his omission, made him more cruelly necessary. You didn't hunt. No more did Ralph nor Simon, he amplified. There isn't more than a half of meat in a crab. Ralph stirred uneasily. Simon, sitting between the twins and Piggy, wiped his mouth and shoved the piece of meat over the rocks to Piggy, who grabbed it. The twins giggled, and Simon lowered his face in shame. Then Jack leaped to his feet, slashed off a green hunk of meat, and flung it at Simon's feet. Eat, darn you! He glared at Simon. Take it! He spun on his heel, center of the bewildered circle of the boys. I got you meat, now eat! Numberless and impressionable frustrations combined to make his rage elemental and awe-inspiring. I painted my face and I stole up. Now you're going to eat. All you and I. We're all eating. Slowly the silence of his mountaintops deepened until the click of the fire and the soft hiss of a roasting meat could be heard clearly. Jack looked around for an understanding, but found only respect. Ralph stood among the ashes of the signal fire, his hands full of meat, saying nothing. Then at the last, Maurice broke the silence. He changed the subject to the only one that could bring the majority of them together. Where'd you find the pig? Roger pointed towards the unfriendly side. They were there, by the sea. Jack, recovering, could not bear to have his story told, so he broke in quickly. We spread around. I crept on hands and knees. The spears fell out because they had barbs on. The pig ran away and then made an awful noise. It turned back and ran to the circle bleeding. All the boys were talking at once. They were all relieved and excited. So we closed in. The first blow had paralyzed its hindquarters, so then the one in the circle could close in, and then they began to beat it and beat it. I cut the pig's throat. The twins, still sharing their identical grin, jumped up and ran around each other. Then the rest joined in, making pig-dying noises and shouting, Once for a knob! Give him a floor penny one! Then Maurice pretended to be the pig and ran squealing around the center. And the hunters, circling still, pretended to beat him. And as they danced, they sang, Kill the pig! Cut her throat! Bash her in! Ralph watched them, envious and resentful. Not till they flagged and the chant died away did he speak again. I'm calling an assembly! And one by one they halted and stood watching him. With the conch, I'm calling a meeting, even if we have to go back into the dark. Down on the platform. When I blow it, and the meeting will begin now. He turned away and walked off, down the mountain. Guys, that is the end of that chapter there. Obviously, another pretty big conflict here rises between Jack and Ralph. That seems to be a pattern as we're going through this book here. I want you guys to think, who was in the right here? Was Jack in the right to be going out and trying to hunt and find the pig? Or was it dumb of him to abandon his post and keep that fire going? Granted, he had no idea if a ship was coming or not, but I don't know about you guys. I'm not a huge Jack fan so far, especially the way he's blatantly bullying Piggy. I don't like that one bit. But with that in mind, guys, I hope that we are all doing well, and I hope everybody is enjoying this book, and I look forward to talking to you guys again soon. Take care.